When it comes to showing appreciation, the gift you choose says everything. Minky Couture luxury blankets make the perfect statement. Soft, stylish, and unforgettable. Whether you're thanking a client, rewarding an employee, or celebrating a milestone, nothing delivers warmth and gratitude like a Minky blanket. With custom options and elegant packaging, your gift will stand out and be remembered long after the moment has passed. Make your corporate gifting extraordinary with Minky Couture. Luxury you can feel. Visit minkycouture.com to get started.
Hello and welcome to 1,000 Natural Shocks, a Bad with Money podcast. I'm your host, Gabe S. Dunn, and with me today, I'm so excited. On the show, we have Alan Gerard, who is a career meteorologist, has worked for NOAA, has worked for NWS, National Weather Service. He has a Substack called Balanced Weather, which I read religiously. And we have a really good conversation about how weather ties into everything. Guys, please listen to this one. I think it is so important. Alan is so knowledgeable, and we are very lucky to have his expertise on the show. As an aside, I just want to say, a lot of stuff is happening every day with the Trump administration. I think last Wednesday, I got designated a terrorist for being trans, something like that. There's a lot of executive orders coming out, and I just want to say that this conversation ties into a lot of what I'm seeing on the ground. I'm not sure if you listen to this show, but you don't follow me on other platforms, or you don't read my Substack, which is 1000naturalshocks.substack.com, or you don't follow me on Instagram, which is Gabe S. Dunn, then you might not know how involved I have been with anti-ICE protesting and basically fighting the Trump administration and lower, until you reach Karen Bass, who's the mayor of Los Angeles. And my colleagues' efforts to get true information out there and to counterbalance what we're going through right now, which is state media. And to me, I have this little show. All I have is the ability to say what I want into this microphone and to have people that are willing to listen to it. And they have been going after trans people extremely hard. They have been going after myself and my colleagues who do anti-fascism work. And I'm not going to be quiet, and I'm not going to not tell you what I'm up to and what you need to know. We talk a bit in this interview about the Mojave Air and Spaceport, which is in California City. And if you haven't read about what's going on in California City, this conversation is relevant to that because they have opened an ICE detention center in an old prison, and it is operating illegally. It does not have permits. It does not have licenses. There are 500 or so detainees there. The desert is extremely hot. They are counting on, if you even escape, let's say, from there, you will still die in the desert. And there's so much more to it. But this is happening in other states. Most notably, there are reports out of Maine of a similar situation. And the Mojave Space and Airport is home to a lot of privatized space travel, a defense creation, Northrop Grumman, as I talk about in this interview, which is a private defense company, and just basically the ability to privatize research in that area without sort of any checks and balances from the government or from the people to even know what's going on. Edwards Air Force Base is there. It is a no-fly zone. If you want to read more about this, I suggest you go to an article that I wrote in autostraddle.com about the illegal detention center that has opened in the desert. There are also tons of resources if you just Google CoreCivic. CoreCivic and Geo Group are the top two most powerful private prison companies. They are running a lot of these private detention centers. And there's so much more to it that hopefully I will get to share because we're still unraveling. Myself and people on the ground in Los Angeles are still unraveling a lot of what this means. But in the conversation with Alan Gerard, we talk about the cutting off of cities or states for federal emergency services, for ability to predict weather events. And it's a testing ground that has come out of a lot of things, but it came out of Katrina, which is basically how much can we rein people in using the weather, and then how much can we abandon them and or use weather as a way to get different states or governors or mayors to obey Trump executive orders or Supreme Court decisions. So, yes, this is about the weather, but it is also about a lot more. And I just want to say, fuck Donald Trump, fuck ICE. And I feel lucky to have this show where I can talk to you guys. And I will continue to do that, even though I guess last week I'm officially a terrorist or something. So please enjoy this conversation with Balanced Weather's Alan Gerard. It covers a lot of this stuff. You can look into it more based on what I'm telling you now. But we do get into worst case scenarios and what I think is probably the end game for this administration's gutting of NOAA and of the National Weather Service, among other little things that are putting this puzzle together. So thank you so much. Love you guys. Enjoy.
Told a lot of lies about achievement. They called you when they got you to believe it. Thumb and finger held to their foreheads in an L shape. Trapped in a capitalist hellscape. Let's fight back and have some talks about class and the massive cost of the disastrous plots of fascists and Nazis, fat cats and fox. It's 1,000 natural shocks. A Bad with Money podcast.
Hello and welcome to 1,000 Natural Shocks, a Bad with Money podcast. I'm your host, Gabe S. Dunn, and with me today is someone whose Substack I found and then have become fascinated by. So, Alan, do you want to tell my audience who you are and what you do?
Thanks for having me, Gabe. My name is Alan Gerard. I'm a meteorologist by trade. I currently run a private consulting firm called Balanced Weather, and I have a Substack called Balanced Weather. I started that about 6 months ago after a 35-year career with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. The first 25 years of that, I was with the National Weather Service, the last half of that time as the meteorologist in charge of the National Weather Service office in Jackson, Mississippi. And then the last 10 years, I've been working for NOAA Research at the National Severe Storms Laboratory, primarily as the head of their warning research development.
Okay, so your job is fascinating at this moment because I found you after the floods in Texas. And I had not I'd slowly considered that the Weather Service and NOAA were about to be gutted, and that was going to be a huge problem. So can you talk about what you've seen? Because coming from decades in that world, is this kind of like a unprecedented situation? Like, what have you seen that's going on?
Yeah, I mean, it really is unprecedented from the fact that, every time you have a change in presidential administration or you have a change in the power balance of Congress, when you're a federal agency, you're going to see some potential changes and adjustments, but nothing like what we've seen in the last 6 months. It's really been unprecedented. I mean, there's really no other word for it. We've seen a ton of job cuts. We've seen a number of changes to just the way the government does business, which to an outside person would seem probably boring and insignificant. But if you're actually trying to do things like scientific research, things like changing how the fact that grants have to be approved by much higher levels, slows everything down and just makes life more difficult. So all of that is really substantial change from what we had seen, obviously prior to January, and to be honest, even during the first Trump administration.
So what does NOAA do, and why is it important, and why are we screwed if it doesn't exist?
Well, the part of NOAA that I'm the most familiar with is the weather part of NOAA, which is, NOAA has several line offices. The two that are mainly focused on weather are the National Weather Service, which is the entity that basically does the daily forecasts and warnings for the country. There's 122 local offices around the country that are responsible for that mission. And then you have NOAA Research, which does oceanic research, but also has a big focus on weather research and climate research. But then, so obviously, if you gut or eliminate those entities, you're leaving yourself much more vulnerable to the vagaries of hazardous weather and flooding. And regardless of what people may think, climate change is a real serious concern, and you're leaving yourself much more vulnerable to not only, dealing with the weather events that occur because of that, you're also leaving yourself less able to understand what's actually going on with the climate. But then NOAA does a lot of other things too. I mean, it's oceanic and atmospheric. So, I mean, it's basically responsible for, ocean, a lot of the oceanography that is done, to ensure that we understand what's going on with ocean currents and fisheries, and understanding how climate change or the way we harvest seafood is impacting fish populations, not only in the oceans, but in the Great Lakes. And there's a lot of, potential issues in the Great Lakes with things like algal blooms and pollution. And all of that is activity that NOAA monitors. NOAA is also responsible for the nation's satellite programs. So all the weather satellites and all the climate data that's collected, NOAA is responsible for all of that as well.
What would be the benefit of cutting from that, unless do you think it comes from just the administration / Elon Musk not understanding the importance of that organization, that agency, or what would be the, even getting conspiratorial, what would be the benefit for that?
Well, it's interesting. My thoughts on that have kind of evolved a little bit over the last several months. When I first started thinking about it, I was thinking about it from a very weather focused perspective, because that's the world I come from. And you start thinking about things like, well, are they looking to try to privatize weather services, make it where people have to, right now, pretty much all weather forecasts and warnings. I mean, you can pay for specialized services, but the basic stuff is all, free of charge. Mm-hmm. So, you look at it from that perspective. But then when you really take a step back and you look at what's going on with, health research and space and, just the bigger picture, it really seems like it's more of an idea of that the more you have independent expertise that is producing objective facts, the harder it is to argue with those if they're getting a lot of attention and focus by the public. And so I really think at some level there's an effort here to if it was just weather, if it was just NOAA that was being attacked, or cut, that would be one thing. But obviously the administration is looking at making major cuts to the National Science Foundation. They're making major cuts to National Institutes of Health. Some of the space exploration is doing okay under the president's budget, but a lot of the earth science and other just kind of basic science is really being cut significantly. And so So I tend to think it's less about anything specific, although certainly climate change, obviously has a lot of political hot button issues associated with it. But even aside from that, I just think it's more of the idea of, to be direct, I think it's more just the idea of the more you discredit expertise, the more you can control the messaging.
I hadn't even considered the idea that you have to just pay for a weather app to find out the weather, and the money goes to whatever the defense budget. Jesus.
Our country is actually pretty unique with the way we do meteorology and weather services, in that in most countries, it's pretty much all the government. The government pretty much does all the data collection in a lot of countries. Obviously, we're talking smaller countries. They're the ones on television doing the broadcasting, and and in the U.S. it's different in that the government does the data collection and produces basic forecasts and warnings, but then we have this robust private sector that does a lot of, like the Weather Channel and these private companies that do a lot of really great work to try to do tailored weather forecasting and information for companies and, specialized use. There's no reason it has to be like that. There are other models. You could go to a model more like some of the other countries. You could also go to a more of a model where, most things you have to pay for. And so it'll be interesting to see where we go with that.
My theory, a part of my theory, is because I've been keeping track of this push in the national parks, specifically Yellowstone, to remove some animals from the endangered species list and create the endangered species list controlled by the state rather than federally. And I've also, read a bit about ocean fracking, because we've probably headed towards drying up the earth for such a thing. And so I wonder, if some of it is if we can't get the information about the earth out there, then private companies and the federal government can just do whatever they want.
Oh, yeah, I definitely think that's part of, kind of what I'm saying, that if you get rid of the expertise and the independent experts that can say, hey, you're drying up this particular aquifer, or, the number of the animals of this species are actually, decreasing below a certain level. If you don't have any independent way to verify that information, well, then it becomes much easier for the government to do, whatever they want. And one of the things that you mentioned that I think is really another aspect to this that really has been, at the beginning you mentioned that you'd found me through the Texas flood coverage, and that, that event has been kind of a little bit of a bellwether for me. And I've talked to some other colleagues about this, that, there was already a push with FEMA to try to push more responsibility to the states for emergency management. I also have an emergency management background, so that's something I pay a lot of attention to. And that's something that concerns me, because the reality is, the states obviously have very different levels of resources. And if you put the response to a Katrina-like disaster primarily on the states, you're going to get a lot different response from a state like, Mississippi or Louisiana than you are from a state that has a lot more resources like Florida does. Mm. But even aside from that, it also kind of brings the idea, talking about privatization of weather services. It also brings the idea of, do some of the states start to take on more of this responsibility?
Oh, no.
And there has been some discussion even in Texas after that event that, that maybe Texas should be looking at developing more independent resources to be able to do flood and weather forecasting. And that's a whole nother angle to this that is something to, I don't think anything imminent is going to happen with that, because the National Weather Service is so well embedded in communities right now, but it is something to be aware of.
No, I'm very heavily into the long-term conspiracy. Like, part of it to me is you cut off, either you withhold federal aid for weather or for with FEMA, if to get different states to bend the knee in certain ways,
right,
or you use it to clear out a population, like what happened in Katrina, where you cleared out, low income people, let's say, and then never sort of rebuilt that infrastructure. So I do think it's really bleak.
Bleak has been a word that's been being used a lot lately. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I do think that one of the things that really bothers me the most about all of this is, weather is something that, literally prior to 6 months ago, if you'd have asked me what is one of, obviously I'm not a political expert, but I do, I pay attention. If you'd have asked me what are, the top 10 issues on Capitol Hill that are bipartisan and don't really have a lot of, debate or, controversy around, I'd have said weather forecasting. I mean, the reality is, in the last 10 years, the job that I had being in charge of warning research at the Severe Storms Lab, I actually interacted with a lot of congressional staff, and it didn't matter whether they were Republican or Democrat. We always got really great support, really great comments that you all are doing great work. We're going to make sure we're supporting it. And even now, from a congressional perspective, it's still kind of the same. I mean, it's almost like Congress and the administration are living on two different planets when it comes to some of these scientific issues. Congress is just going along like this is normal appropriations, and they're going to put together a budget and they're going to fund it, and the administration is going to execute it when that's not what the evidence supports. The evidence supports that the administration has its own vision of what it wants to do, and it's going to execute it regardless.
Yeah, I was thinking about the concept of decentralizing weather, and it is like what you're talking about is like rebellious weather forecasting, like pirate radio, decentralized, people with their own satellites or their own method, expertise. I'm not sure how you're let's say gathering your information. Maybe you have inside sources to things, etc. And so it almost becomes like the weather is this underground leftist event, like group, like what?
Well, it's really interesting that you put it like that, because, another aspect of the federal meteorology world is the Defense Department. I mean, they have their own meteorological services. I mean, they rely on the Weather Service for some data, but they do their own forecasting and computer modeling and things like that. And they definitely, I mean, I don't remember their exact motto, but the gist of it is that we're going to use weather intelligence to defeat our enemies, that we're going to have better weather information than our adversaries are when we have these conflicts, and we're going to leverage that to do
fly planes. Yeah,
right, exactly. If we know that when we do this, bombing run, and I don't know anything about it, but I'm just making hypothetically, if we know that the weather is going to be doing whatever we think it's going to be doing during this bombing run, and the adversary doesn't know that, then we have an advantage. And that's really, in a much more economic way, is a lot of what the private sector looks at with weather information. If I'm a clothing company and I'm trying to figure out how many winter coats to produce this year, and I can get some sort of long-term weather forecast information that's better than my competitors that tells me that this winter is going to be colder than normal in the Northeast, so I need to have more, I need to produce more inventory. That's an economic advantage. And so those are the kind of things that the meteorological community has been thinking about, that would be a growing aspect of the science and what, like, as we train new meteorologists, the kind of work that they might be doing in the future. But all of that is based on the idea that meteorological data is open and free to everybody. And that's part of where I think you're coming from, is that as technology gets cheaper and people can, part of the reason why meteorology has always been primarily a government, led function is because it's so expensive. Putting in radar networks, launching geostationary satellites takes a lot of money, a lot of science, a lot of resources. And a private company is not going to invest. I mean, it literally takes, a decade to go from we're going to plan the next geostationary satellite to it's launched and it's actually, gathering data. And, most companies don't have the resources or bandwidth to do that kind of stuff. But as we're building some of these, bigger multinational companies like Google and Amazon, and they have not only more resources, they could gain advantage by having better weather information than their competitors. Like, just for example, if Amazon is trying to figure out how to best deploy their drone delivery service for the next 48 hours, having good weather information is going to be really important for maximizing that. So those are the kind of things where you're starting to see more private companies do things like launch. Now, to this point, they haven't been launching the giant geostationary satellites, but launching satellites that can gather weather data. And we're getting to the point now where quantity can trump quality. If you can put a whole bunch of low Earth orbit satellites up there that are gathering data all the time, that's a potential advantage.
Yeah, so that just made my eye twitch when you were talking about that. Yeah, that's bad. And I think that's like so capitalist over the ability for people to protect themselves from heat waves, from floods, from, hurricanes and storms. Like, it's just, if only a certain level of person can access weather data, it's just like so wild. I mean, in the last, you talked about things becoming partisan. In the last, 25 years that you've been working on this, was this ever a conversation before?
Was what ever a conversation before?
That companies would take over the weather.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. Back about 10 years ago, it was early in my career at the Severe Storms Lab. We actually were doing a thing as part of like NOAA planning where we had some consultants come in and talk about some of these, really long range ways in which, government and the economy might evolve. And we talked about some scenarios like this, which, to be honest, 10 years ago seemed, I won't say science fiction-y, but they seemed a little out there. But now that we're here, I realize that these futurists probably had reason to think what they were thinking. And, one thing I will say, to be fair, I mentioned some of these, larger multinational companies. Google, is doing a lot of work with applications of artificial intelligence to weather forecasting. But to their credit, at least to this point, they have been very open and have partnered with the federal government. For example, one of the things, and I talk about, a lot on my Substack, as we've been dealing with a lot of tropical weather threats here recently, is, Google has this DeepMind AI modeling system that has shown a lot of skill predicting the development and track of hurricanes. But they are partnering with the NOAA's National Hurricane Center. They're making the data freely available. They're, like I said, they're partnering with NOAA on the research and the development. So, I mean, if we can encourage those kind of approaches, because I completely agree with what you just said, Gabe. What really worries me is, especially after having been a meteorologist in a place like Mississippi for much of my career, I know that there are a lot of socioeconomically vulnerable people in this country who really need weather information, but they are not going to be able to afford to pay for it. So to me, it's really critical that, even if we get to a point and obviously we are a capitalist society, and, you can purchase more as you can afford more, and to some extent, weather is already to some extent like that. I mean, I pay for certain weather services that that the regular member of the public doesn't, but that's because I have a need for it and I have an interest in it. I just want to make sure that we get to the point where if you're somebody living in a mobile home in rural Mississippi, that you can get the information, the critical core information, tornado warnings, tornado forecasts that you need to keep yourself and your family safe.
What does a TV meteorologist do? What like as part of a local news team? Because there's been talk of a lot of these stations being run by one company, which is Sinclair, and a lot of repetition of different news scripts. And I'm just curious, is there like a state media version of the weather? What exactly is a local, ABC affiliate, small town, or maybe even just whatever? What does that meteorologist do on a TV level?
Well, I mean, to be clear, it's definitely something that's evolving quite a bit right now. I was actually at a professional conference a couple of weeks ago, and there was I sat in on the broadcast meteorology workshop day, and there was a lot of discussion about how much it's changing. But I mean, on a very basic level, I mean, what a local broadcast meteorologist is doing is they're taking their own understanding and expertise of what's going on with the atmosphere. They're partnering with their local National Weather Service office to get their expertise, to understand what the Weather Service is doing as far as issuing any warnings or things like that. And they're trying to communicate that to their audience in as effective a way as possible. Now, I mean, there's always, when I started as a meteorologist back in the late 80s, I actually started as a weather producer at the ABC affiliate in St. Louis when I was in college and when I first got out of college. And at that time, having a weather producer, that was a pretty new thing, to have somebody. I mean, I was basically just doing graphics and forecasts behind the scenes. I mean, even then there was, there's always this kind of inherent tension between building audience and being scientifically accurate. And I definitely think that tension, obviously I'm not a broadcast meteorologist, but I talk to a lot of my colleagues, and I think that tension has, it evolves and it's grown. I know one of the things that I hear a lot of my colleagues bemoan is, and I'll just be honest, I don't know whether it's Sinclair or Nexstar, which one of them, which ones do it and exactly how they do it. But I know a lot of these corporate news entities now have this, they have like a red alert weather day or a, whatever they call it. It's basically some, catchy phrase that, a consultant has come up with to try to make people think that, that today's a day you really need to be paying attention to the weather for whatever the reason may be. And I know that there is definitely concern among like the broadcast meteorology community that there's pressure to have more of these days and a certain number of these days to try to drive up ratings. And those are the kind of tension that you get the more private influence you have in this than you do the government. I mean, because obviously the National Weather Service is going to do their thing, and the people that work for the National Weather Service are going to get paid whether they issue one tornado warning or 1,000 tornado warnings. It doesn't matter. Their ultimate goal is to protect the public. I mean, and serve society. They're not worried about ratings or how many clicks they get or anything like that. Again, though, I mean, to me, what's going on in weather is symptomatic of a broader societal, it's like we're pretty much the only country that allows pharmaceutical drugs to be advertised on television. I mean, in most other countries, you don't do that. The doctors decide who's going to get what and why. I do think that that's just kind of a societal trend. I just hope that we don't, that weather is one of those areas where, I mean, there is some of that's gone on, like I said, with like in broadcast meteorology and other places. But for the most part, and knowing like my colleagues in broadcast meteorology, they're all in it for the service too, from everyone I know. So, as long as we can keep it reasonable and keep the partnership between broadcasters and the National Weather Service, I think we'll be in good shape. It'll just be if we start getting too far down the slippery slope of, corporate running.
Yeah, I'm from Florida, and I remember there was always kind of this push to make storms really dangerous. And, it was like, of course, like water jugs are going to sell out. People are going to buy plywood to put on their windows. And sometimes it would turn into something, and sometimes it really would not.
Right.
And I think that that you're right, obviously, about keeping people glued to the television in making something as so much worse or seeming so much worse. And then there's also that element of not making something seem serious enough or not being prepared enough for other weather, disasters. And I was thinking of the fires here in LA. And there's one app, I'm now forgetting what it's called, but Watch app maybe.
Yeah.
Yes. So there was one app that all of a sudden everyone had.
Right.
All of a sudden, this was like the most it's like Zoom at the beginning of the pandemic. All of a sudden, this was the most popular app you could be on, and people were tracking the fires. And if that app had become paid, like a paywall,
right,
that would have been a really good day for that app.
Right. But luckily, at least so far, that app is, and I know what app you're talking about, it's a, run by a nonprofit, and they've kept it, that way. And that, it's funny, one of the things that I've talked about with some of my colleagues, and since I retired, and, with the, circling back to some of the stuff we were talking about the government cuts, I mean, one of the things that's being talked about is, that's in the presidential budget for next fiscal year, is completely eliminate the NOAA Research Office. Essentially, some of the severe weather research would be rolled into the National Weather Service, but the Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research would be eliminated. Congress doesn't seem to have any interest in that, but who knows where it'll end up. But one of the things I've talked about with some of my colleagues, if there is a sudden glut of talented meteorologists and scientists who don't have jobs, is should we be looking at putting together some sort of like a 501c3 nonprofit meteorological service that would do the kind of thing that like the Watch app does, only do it for weather.
Wow. Again, it's like pirate radio. It's like underground, like punk weather reporting. Right. It's so wild.
But the thing that's concerning about it is you can't make weather information out of thin air. You do have to have some level of data collection infrastructure, and that is where it gets touchy, because like I obviously do a lot of actual weather, talking about weather in my Substack, but I'm relying on government weather information. I mean, I'm using government radar data. I'm using government satellite data. I'm using computer model forecasts that are produced by the government. I could envision how I could set up a nonprofit to help, provide better weather information to socioeconomically vulnerable people and develop apps and things like that. But if I've got to develop my own radar network and satellite data and run my own computer models, that's you're talking about a whole level of magnitude more resources than
one person could
do. Right.
Could you get weather information, at least like in a global sense, and include us in that from other countries? Like
and that that is actually what a lot of other countries do. They basically rely on, a lot of smaller countries rely on like the computer models from the United States and the Europeans, because they're the best models, and we at least as of now, we're committed to full. We're basically part of UN treaties that say weather information is going to be freely exchanged and available.
That was my next question.
Yeah. So, right now that, that works. And as long as the government, and that's one of the things that at least to this point, there hasn't been much debate about the idea that the government is going to continue to do the basic data collection and, the radar network and all of that. And hopefully that will continue, because the reality is everybody relies on, even if you take the view that the government right now is most focused on, the capitalist aspect of it and, building, market share and things like that. Even if you assume that, our entire economy relies on the idea that people are going to be able to know when it's going to rain. Mm-hmm. So if you assume that, then even if you tell people they have to come up with their own forecast, they still need the basic data. They need somebody taking weather observations. They need somebody operating a radar network. They need somebody running satellites. So one would hope that there will continue to be agreement that at least at that basic foundational level, the data will continue to be, gathered.
Yeah, my thought was you withhold the U.S. data, you take it out of the UN treaties, you withhold the U.S. data, you leverage it to get other countries to do what you want, or you, the U.S., takes it away and then says, you can pay us for it if you want to have access, India or Asia or, New Zealand, Australia. If you want to pay us for that information, like, go right ahead. And then the other option that I'm thinking of is because of the connections to NASA and how NASA actually does a lot of defense, planes and things like that. Although I will say defense, probably offense, I've driven out to the desert, to the Mojave Desert, and don't worry about why, but was looking at, Northrop Grumman, and what's it called? And NASA having the Mojave Air and Spaceport. And so it's like you privatize that, and then you're mostly building also like B-12 bombers, and you're keeping stuff away from other countries, like you said, so that that this plane can withstand X, Y, and Z, but they don't.
Right. Yeah, and that's, I mean, it would be interesting if you kind of take your, hypothetical out to its, conclusion, would other countries pay the United States for weather data? I mean, the one good thing about it is our weather data. I mean, at the core of it, our weather data isn't any more important than Canada's weather data or India's weather data. I mean, it's all needed to generate a global forecast. So, but as far as the potential, it kind of goes back to what I was saying about the Defense Department and the military aspects of meteorology. I mean, certainly if you get into a situation where you're thinking we're in primarily an adversarial relationship with other countries, it starts to become less beneficial to be sharing your weather data with whoever. So, hopefully, we maintain international cooperation, and because I mean, really, the reality of it is, if that breaks down, weather forecasting becomes, weather forecasting is definitely one of those things that really requires a global, global cooperation. And if we lose, even during the Cold War, the U.S. and the Soviets were sharing weather data. So one would assume we'd have to go a long way down the road before we started messing with that. But it's definitely a whole new world right now. So trust me, I've seen a lot of things happen in the last 6 months that I would have never guessed would happen.
Covering the floods in Texas, it was interesting. The camp itself that was most affected was a religious camp. And you saw a lot of commentary coming out of there about God's will, and this is unavoidable, which was maddening because it's absolutely avoidable. In terms of having alarms or different alerts and things in different places, although it was wild to read that they had talked about putting in alarms and had decided that it was too expensive because it's $50,000 per, I think.
I think that's right, yeah.
What is the level of maybe you don't know, but the rise of Christian nationalism with the idea that weather is just, it is what it is, and it's God doing it?
I have at least a little bit of concern about that. And just keeping it real, it was really that event that kind of brought it home to me, because when I was thinking about some of the pieces that I wrote for my Substack about that, my wife reminded me of this saying, and I'm not going to get it right, but basically it's this religious saying, row away from the rocks. Yes, there are rocks, and maybe God has put them there, but you have the ability to row away from them.
Mm-hmm.
And that, that's kind of what I've thought about, about how this needs to be framed, is that even if your faith tells you that it's God's will that there's going to be a flood, that doesn't mean you can't walk up the hill.
Right.
I mean,
yeah.
so if you know that it's coming, and I don't think there's anything, I mean, I'm not like, a particularly religious person, but I have enough knowledge of religion to know that I don't think there's anything in Christianity that tells you you can't be aware of the weather and react to it. And so, coming back to your original question, I do think that there is some of that in some of what we're seeing, in that whether it's this or other, controversial aspects of our, society today, that there is this kind of sense of, you just accept God's will and not try to fight it. But and maybe at some level that's part of the anti-science at a whole. I mean, you could say the same thing again about healthcare. Why? It's obviously God's will for you to have a brain tumor and die. Why should we invest a bunch of research in trying to figure out how to save your life? And so I do think that at some subliminal, at some kind of almost like, subconscious level, there may be some of that going on in our society today, but hopefully it's not the main driving force for why we're seeing some of the push we were seeing in, reducing science funding and things like that.
There's a Jewish story that's similar where I think it's Jewish, where there's a flood and a guy they try to get him out in a car, and he's like, no, God will save me, don't worry. And then he goes up to his roof, and then like a boat comes, and he's like, no, God will save me, don't worry. Then helicopter comes, he's like, no, God will save me. Then he dies, then he gets to meet God in the afterlife, and he's like, why didn't you save me? And God's like, I sent you a car and a boat and a helicopter, and you didn't do anything. And I think about that a lot.
Yeah, and I do too. And that's the kind of thing we have. The car and the helicopter and the boat with a lot of these types of situations. And, just, thinking about that Texas flood, obviously there's some aspect to every event like that. That was a huge catastrophic flash flood. There are aspects to it that are unpredictable. There are aspects to it that are, difficult to prepare for. But there are certain basic levels of precaution, like having, a way to receive warnings. Once you have a warning, start monitoring the water levels and having a plan to know, okay, if we start to see the water rising, this is what we're going to train our staff to know this is what we're going to do. Those kind of just basic emergency management and preparedness activities, we have the knowledge and we have the weather and flood information to be able to do those basic things. So even before we get to the ideas of some of these higher level things, like, one of the things that was talked about in that event is, you can install sirens that are connected to a system that monitor water level, and when the water level gets up to is going up at a certain rate, it automatically sounds a siren. That's awesome, but obviously that's really expensive, and you have to figure out whether it makes sense. But regardless of that, doesn't preclude you from taking the lower levels of precaution, and that's where. And it's not just with this. You see it in a lot of places that it's almost like, there's this level of defeatism where, if we can't completely solve the problem, we're just not going to do anything. And that I don't understand that.
What are some things that people can do to prepare? Let's say if they want to push for something for their city or county to have, but also just individually, what would you say in your expertise?
Well, I think the first thing is people have to know what the threat is where they, whether they live or where they're, vacationing, like that's one of the things that I think is really, as people travel a lot, if you're on the West Coast, and you're from the Midwest, while you're on the West Coast, you're under a different threat from Mother Nature than you are in the Midwest. In the Midwest, your main concern is probably tornadoes and flash flooding. On the West Coast, it's probably wildfire and tsunami. So, I think really the most important thing is to be educated about what are the risks where you're at, and at a basic level, what can I do to be aware and prepare myself? Like if say you're traveling to Hawaii and and tsunami is a significant risk there, just get basic level of awareness. Okay, how am I going to know if there's a tsunami? Is there a siren? Am I going to get an alert on my phone? And if I do, what is the basic, steps I have to take to keep me and my family safe? I mean, that to me at a very basic level is what everybody needs to do for their own, where they live and then where they're going to be traveling to.
Do you think people should have a go bag?
I do. I mean, especially if you live in an area where you're vulnerable to things like wildfire and flash flood, where you may have to evacuate at a moment's notice. I definitely think, I'll just share that, like, I have never really lived anywhere where wildfire was a really big concern, but it's at least somewhat of a concern here in Oklahoma. And we had a pretty big wildfire outbreak this spring, and it never got to the point where I was actually worried we were going to have to evacuate, but it did make me start thinking about it. And most of the time my concern is a tornado, and I know what I'm going to do in a tornado. And I haven't really prepared, even though I'm a trained meteorologist, emergency management professional. I have supplies and stuff that would enable me to get through a winter storm or a tornado, but I don't really have a go bag of my, key documents and stuff that I could just grab and run out the door. And so, yeah, I think if you're, particularly if you live somewhere where, a wildfire breaks out tomorrow afternoon and you got to get out, yeah, that you can grab and just head for shelter.
Why the weather? Why are you a weather guy?
Well, most meteorologists, if you talk to them and ask them that question, it usually is something they wanted to do since they were a kid. And I'm certainly no exception to that. And I actually, even though most of my career ended up being spent dealing with tornadoes and severe thunderstorms and hurricanes, I actually got into weather because of snow. I loved snow when I was a kid. I grew up in the St. Louis area. We had a number of really cold and snowy winters in the 70s and early 80s. And I was just really fascinated with snow and wanted to learn about it and wanted to learn. Essentially, I wanted to be able to tell family and friends that, hey, it might snow tomorrow, so we might not have school, or I just was really fascinated by that and by the idea that you could actually kind of predict the future. I think that sometimes we forget that that's what meteorologists are doing, and that, you know, for all of the grief that meteorologists sometimes get, there really isn't any other part of society where we can, even with the level of accuracy that meteorologists do, predict the future. It really is an amazing scientific achievement that we've gotten to the point that we can predict the weather and climate as well as we can. And I've always been a science geek, and so it just, you know, became natural that that's the science I wanted to do.
That's really sweet. Can lightning strike in the same place twice?
Absolutely.
Oh, no.
Yes, absolutely it can.
Oh, no.
Yes. And in fact, you'll occasionally see videos from like someplace like the Empire State Building where, you know, lightning will hit it 3 times in 5 minutes. I mean, yeah.
Wow. I have a million more questions, but I do have to let you go. And I love your Substack. I love getting into the specifics of stuff that we take for granted. You know, I grew up where people would personally blame the meteorologist for the hurricanes.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that.
I always enjoy the sort of quirkier personalities of the weather people on local news. I think, I just love people who love something deeply. And so, you know, I think your Substack, perhaps, you know, I said you might find a lot of this old hat, or you talk to people who know about this stuff all the time. But the reason for me reading your Substack was I don't experience that.
Sure.
So I'm like just reading stuff where it's a whole world I had no knowledge of.
And that's one of the reasons I really wanted to do this, was to try to give people a little bit of a behind the scenes so that they can appreciate that, you know, like you said, I think we take it for granted. I think we take for granted we're going to look at a phone app and it's going to tell us, you know, it's going to be 78 degrees today and sunny. But there's a lot of work going on under the hood to get you that. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a lot easier to just kind of, you know, cut funding for that stuff when people don't understand what actually has to go into it. So I do think it's really important for people to know.
Just one last question. I always like asking this about specific like niche areas. Is there like drama? Is there like weather beef? Like people that have, you know, long-standing beef with each other or different factions?
Oh, absolutely. We're all humans, man. Yeah, of course. Yes.
You're just at the conferences, like these two people hate each other.
Oh, yes. There are definitely those sorts of things, for sure. Yep, we're still human beings, so you know it definitely, and from what I've seen in the sciences, it's that way across the board.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Where can people find you and more information about you?
Yeah, so you can go to my webpage, which is balancedweather.com, which I post links to my Substack post, but also have some information about my background and stuff. And obviously you can go to the Substack, balancedweather.substack.com. I try to post at least one thing every day. I'm always open to input and love to hear questions.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Gabe. I really appreciate it.
1,000 Natural Shocks, a Bad with Money podcast, is a production of Noted Bisexual, produced by Melisa D. Monts and Diamond MPrint Productions, edited by Diane Kang, post-production sound by Coco Llorens, and music by Zach Sherwin as sung by Sam Barbera. Thank you, love you, bye!